So please join me in welcoming Professor Gwilliams.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindy, for the great introduction. Does everyone hear me okay? I do have this nice little microphone on. Okay. Good. We're good? I think we're good. I can hear myself, so. Okay, great. So I am really so excited to get the chance to talk to you about some of my research today. So my work is trying to understand how the brain achieves speech comprehension. And you'll see that throughout my talk and in my research in general, I essentially view speech comprehension as a mapping problem that the brain needs to solve. So the idea is that the brain needs to take the auditory signal of speech and from that derive a conceptual understanding of what it is that's being said. And my work is trying to understand this computational architecture which maps from sound to meaning. What is the magic that happens in the middle? Okay, so understanding this processing system is not a small thing to solve. So to make sure that I'm making measurable progress towards this big goal, I organize my work around 3 sub-questions. So the first is, what are the representations that the brain generates in order to map from sound to meaning? And some examples of representations would be a cochlear representation of the auditory signal, or maybe something more abstract, like the syllables or words that are contained. We also need to understand the operations which generate and manipulate those representations. And some examples of operations might be filtering of the signal or applying a nonlinear categorization. And finally, we need to understand how information passes through the system. So this would include evidence for feed-forward connections, feedback connections, skip connections, and recurrent connections. Okay. But I also wanted to zoom out for a moment and highlight that understanding the processing system in this way is really only one small part of what makes language so central to human life and what makes it such an interesting thing to study. So usually when we're understanding speech, we actually do so under a dialogue rather than the monologue of speech that you are receiving from me right now. And that also introduced managing interesting things like timing of taking turns or accommodating your speech to others. Also, when someone's talking, you don't just derive from that kind of the literal meaning of what they're saying. You also understand other things about them, like what their current emotional state is, for example, or maybe where they are from approximately geographically. And finally, language needs to be understood relative to context, because the context is going to largely govern what it is that you do and should understand from a given utterance. So for example, if I say, I like bringing orzo to the beach, then maybe you imagine something like this: bowls of pasta by the sea. However, if I tell you a very important fact about myself, also fun, but I didn't want to ruin the surprise, is that I have a dog called Orzo. So if I now say an acoustically identical utterance, now you might imagine something a little bit different. So in understanding speech, we also need to understand that speech relative to our world knowledge. And so I just wanted to highlight that even though I'm not going to be discussing these components today, it's important to understand language processing in this broader social context, and of course draws upon many other domain general processes like memory encoding and memory retrieval and perceptual inference. Okay, so just to zoom out just one little bit further, just to kind of introduce myself to you all, it is really critical that I conduct my work in this multidisciplinary approach. I really work at the intersection between cognitive science, neuroscience, and computational approaches, including machine learning. And I develop novel algorithms with which to analyze neural time series. And I take advantage in language modeling as a way of generating hypotheses of representations and computations that the brain may implement. I also investigate language processing using naturalistic paradigms in order to understand how different levels of linguistic representations actually interact with one another and to get a real world view into language processing. As Lindy mentioned, I'm extremely dedicated to open science, where to me, that means both the sharing of data, code, and papers, but also applying very concerted efforts to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, so that science is something which is open and available to all. And finally, I work with neural data across different spatial resolutions. So today, you're going to hear about some of my work, which has recorded brain activity from populations of neurons using MEG, as well as some of my more recent work where I'm using neuropixels, also in humans, to record single neuron activity across the cortical depth. So by using these different neural recording techniques, I've been able to understand things about the representations, the operations, and the information flow that the brain implements in order to understand speech. I would love, of course, to talk to you about all of these studies, but I decided to narrow it down to just a few. And I selected these subset of studies because I think they're most representative of my work in general and representative of where I want to move my work going forward. Okay, so the research questions that I'm going to address for you today are: first, how does the brain represent hierarchical linguistic structure across time? Second, what computations support speech sequence processing? And finally, how are those representations actually implemented at the level of individual neurons? Okay, so our first call is understanding hierarchical linguistic representations. So going back to this previous slide I had, why is it that the brain can't just map directly from sounds to meaning? The reason is that this mapping is largely arbitrary. So if I try to convey to you the same meaning in English, Arabic, and Basque, those sounds and their configuration would be largely very, very different. And so the idea here is that in order to bridge this arbitrary mapping, the brain needs to generate a hierarchy of representations in order to go from one side of the equation to the other. Okay, and here are some candidates of those representations based on linguistic theory. And one of the crucial questions here is, what are the correct representations that we should put here in order to go from sound to meaning? The second crucial question is, in what order are those different representations generated? So it might be easy to assume that speech units get generated in order of complexity. So phonemes get generated which combine to form syllables, which combine to form morphemes, etc. However, when you're listening to continuous speech, they don't necessarily need to be generated in that way because, for example, you might be able to anticipate the word or the speech sound that someone's going to say before they even say it. And so in the case of continuous speech processing, it's possible that some of the higher order structure actually gets generated before the lower level structure. So the two components of this processing system we're going to look at for the first study is, first, what representations does the brain generate when listening to continuous speech? And second of all, in what order are those representations generated, such that we might therefore infer the information flow? Okay, so the way that I addressed those questions was by recruiting 21 native English participants to listen to a series of short stories while I record their neural activity with magnetoencephalography. And 2 hours worth of continuous story listening corresponds to neural responses around 16,000 words per participant, which in my realm of language, cognitive neuroscience, this is quite a large set of data to be able to work with. I'm going to play you a little segment of one of these stories now, just so you can get a sense of the stimuli that we were using. You'll notice that I chose to use a synthesized voice so I could get more control of the actual acoustic input, and I'm happy to discuss possible consequences that might have in the Q&A if people are interested.
On the bone. He was wearing a shin-turnu jacket and snow boots, but he had on a Hawaiian shirt underneath and khaki shorts of all things. His tan was obviously deep and old, but it looked like a work tan, not the kind you get at the beach. His hands were thin and huge-knuckled with obvious calluses.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of the stimuli that we were using. I actually had a shock the other day. I was taking a train from Philadelphia to New York, and I was there at the train waiting for the announcements of what platform I should go to, and this voice came over the tannoy, and I'm like, whoa, the experiment is coming back to haunt me. Right, and I also wanted to mention, again, Lindy, thanks for the great introduction. This is the data set that Lindy was referring to. This has really proved to be an extremely valuable resource. So I myself have been able to address a number of really exciting questions about speech processing using this data set. So I decided to put the effort to very carefully curate this data set and make it available for the public to use as well. And this is something that I plan to continue doing going forward. Okay, so I annotated these short stories for a range of potential representations that might be encoded in neural activity. So I annotated 50 features in total, and I grouped those 50 features into 6 feature families that I'll explain now. So at the lowest level, we have phonetic features, which refer to how each individual speech sounds. Then we have sublexical properties, like how many syllables and morphemes are contained in each word. And then we have word class, which means, is this word a determiner, an adjective, a noun, a verb, etc. And then we have properties relating to the syntactic structure that word is being used within. So that could be how many branches of the tree do we create at a particular word, and how many do we close, and how deep into that tree structure does a word occur. And then finally, we have proxies for semantic representations, where here I'm using the first 10 principal components of the GloVe word embeddings of the stories. For those of you who may be interested, this is a non-contextual embedding. So that means that the word in all of its context will be given the same vector. I have done some work with contextualized embeddings that I'll be happy to, again, discuss later on if anyone's interested. Okay, so these are the different representations that we're going to test for evidence for. And as I said, there was also the second component of this is understanding the order with which those get generated. So let me just show you the 2 hypotheses we have for that here. So on the one hand, we have the proposition that language is compositional, and so language processing should be compositional as well. So from that perspective, we should be able to decode the lower level properties of speech, like phonetics, before we can decode the higher order properties of speech. The alternative is to say that, yes, there is going to be a relationship between where the feature is in the hierarchy and the latency of decoding, but that relationship is actually going to be inverted. So in continuous speech, we'll actually be able to decode the higher order properties before we can decode the lower level ones. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. I'm going to show you the result of our decoding analysis, where I'm going to show you time is on this x-axis here, where 0 is the moments that the word ends. And yeah, let me orient you to these plots by first showing you the result for the phonetic decoding. So you see that this plot is made up of a number of lines. That's because there's multiple features in that feature family that I'm showing you. And this bar here is the result of a temporal permutation cluster test, indicating approximately when in time we can decode this feature family better than chance. So we can decode these phonetic properties from about 0 to 200 milliseconds, sublexical properties from about -100 to about 600 milliseconds, word class about -200 to 200 milliseconds, syntactic operations from about -200 to about a second, and then syntactic state and the semantic vectors were decodable from about half a second before the word ended until about a second and a half after. So the first thing that we can gain from this result is to say, well, actually, all of these features which had previously been proposed by linguistic theory to be relevant for processing, indeed, we do find evidence for them being encoded in neural activity here. And we also have some interesting things to say about the dynamics of that processing as well. So we find that indeed the higher order properties seem to be decodable earlier in time than the lower level ones. And I also wanted to highlight that there's also a significant period of time with which you can decode the entire hierarchy from an instantaneous brain response, which to me is really incredible. Just the representational richness of how much information is encoded in this neural activity at the same period of time. Okay, so if I pull back these two hypotheses, the only hypothesis which predicted this kind of inverted relationship between the hierarchy and latency was this reverse hierarchical hypothesis. And it's actually really interesting that this was the hypothesis to win out here, because reverse hierarchical approaches have been primarily put forward for visual processing in the past, and much less so for auditory processing, and kind of even less, again, for speech processing. So what this approach has to say for itself in the visual domain is that the visual sensory input itself is actually super noisy and ambiguous as to the higher order information that you're trying to extract from it. So in the situation where you have context that you can use, you should use that to bias and guide how that lower level information is actually interpreted. And so I think that the same thing is happening here for the case of speech processing, that this higher order structure, like the semantics and the syntactic frame, is being used to guide how the lower level information is processed. But maybe you're thinking to yourself, okay, Laura, this all sounds very nice, but all you've shown us is that there's differences in latency. You haven't said anything at all that there is passing of information across different levels. So let me show you some evidence towards that now. This is actually from a different paper that it got accepted recently. Yes?
Sorry, could you just tell me a little bit about the signals, the MEG signals that you're decoding to get these?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for bringing that. I kind of skipped over the details there, but so this particular MEG system has 208 channels, and I'm taking the amplitude over those channels as the input to a decoder. So this is just a low pass filtered signal, so low pass at 40 hertz, and it's just the at each millisecond separately, using the pattern of activity over those 208 channels to fit a classifier to say this is a noun or not a noun. Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any? Yes, question at the back.
Are they going to, for a given word, are they going to be related to the previous word? Well, like I'm looking at the coding answer, it looks like it's about chance they put both like negative 0.2.
Yeah, that's right.
How do you like in thinking about this? Like, I'm used to working with fMRI data where everything gets blurred over time. Anyway.
Right.
How are you thinking about like when you're decoding something happening for a word at a given time point, and there's a word at the time point beforehand that probably predicts a lot of semantics?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, again, I washed over some of the technological details here, but yes, there is a severe problem of correlation both across the features and within a feature across time, word by word. And properties at the higher levels, like you rightly pointed out, the semantic vectors, they have a stronger autocorrelation than some of the other properties. So the semantic vector at this word will be correlated with the next one. So what I actually do here in assessing the model performance, I actually fit an additional regression model where I'm including all of the features plus the property the value of that feature on the previous word and the subsequent word. And if you notice, the y-axis here is actually a beta coefficient, not a performance score. This is the beta coefficient, which maps the value of interest to the other value of interest above and beyond all of these other features in the model, which is also part of why the numbers are so tiny here, because I'm really looking at the unique variance of that feature above and beyond all of these other correlations. Does that answer the question?
But aren't a lot of these still being
Right, so the reason, okay, yeah, which means that the reason that this is before T0 is because you can predict what the next word is going to be, essentially. So all of this pre-zero stuff is anticipatory prediction. And if you look, for example, just at the first word of the sentence, you don't get this effect. You don't get anything pre-zero because you can't predict what the semantics of that first word of the sentence were going to be.
one last data?
Zoom won't pick you up without this.
Just one last quick data
Yeah,
question. You
please.
have 208 measurement electrodes.
Channels, yep.
Channels. And is the spatial arrangement of some of them such that, as a kind of a check, that they're the ones from some particular location are more informative than others, and you'll tell us about?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into the spatial analysis for this, but in the next project, we're just going to focus in on this phonetic level. And there you do see this kind of sanity check that the information is around auditory cortices, as you would expect them to be. I did look at the weights of the decoder for these higher order properties, and I'm not sure if it's, so everything is distributed everywhere, which may indeed be true. But I think that this really speaks to MEG maybe not being the appropriate tool to ask spatial questions. Yeah, thanks. Are we good? Okay, all right, cool. Thanks for the questions. Okay, so what I want to show you now is that information actually gets passed between these different levels. And the way that I'm going to do that is by focusing on this intermediary level of word class, which is the perfect level to look at because word class conveniently is often ambiguous. So if you take a word like hammer, hammer can either be used as a noun, as in she took the hammer, or as a verb, as in she likes to hammer. And so we essentially have, this same word will be assigned two different labels depending on the context that it's occurring within. And so if word class is generated from the top down, then we should find that when we investigate the predictions of the decoder that we trained on word class, it should predict the context-sensitive labels of word class. In contrast to the alternative hypothesis, which is to say that actually word class is built from the bottom up. And so hammer, most of the time, is used as a noun. And so the decoder is always going to predict noun, 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 regardless of the context that occurs within. So just to give some details on this particular analysis. So these vectors represent the true value of word class under a top-down hypothesis and under a bottom-up hypothesis. So this is a verb, a noun, and all of these are the same because most of the time a word is used as its most frequent word class. And in about 10% of cases, the predictions under these two hypotheses are going to be different. So we put this to our advantage here and train a decoder on the 208 MEG channels, but only on the cases where these two labels were identical. And then we take the MEG data for the trials where these two hypotheses actually predict different labels, and we just look at the predictions of that classifier and say, are the predictions more close to this top-down hypothesis, or are they more close to the bottom-up hypothesis? Okay, so that's what I'm plotting to you now, but in a more time-resolved manner. The orange line indicates the correlation in simplified terms between the predictions of the classifier and the top-down labels. And the purple is the predictions of the classifier correlated with the bottom-up labels. And what you see is that the predictions significantly correlate with the top-down labels and significantly anti-correlate with the bottom-up labels. So what this tells us is that the brain seems to indeed be predicting directly the context-sensitive label of word class, suggesting that information indeed is being passed down to inform the lower levels. I'm going to skip over this. It's interesting, but let's keep moving. Okay, so let's zoom out and summarize what it is that I just told you. So what I think is going on here is that information at these high levels is being used to inform and make predictions about the upcoming information at the lower levels. And then once the sensory input of speech is actually received, then this can be integrated with and updated, if necessary, with the predictions that were actually made. And it's important to note that a lot of the time, the predictions a system makes aren't going to be correct. Otherwise, I might not bother actually talking to you at all. You could just hallucinate this entire talk for yourselves. And so it is necessary to have this subsequent kind of bottom-up compositional process. And again, I just wanted to highlight that there is also this significant period of time where all of these different levels of representation are accessible by the system at the same time. Okay, great. So how does the brain represent hierarchical linguistic structure? It seems to do so under this reverse, then parallel, then feed-forward generation of representations. So the second thing I want to talk about is what computations are in place to support rapid speech sequence processing. Okay, and as I mentioned, this second project is going to focus on these lower aspects of the linguistic hierarchy. Okay, this is, oh, I didn't, sorry, should not be here. This is what should be here, sorry. Okay, so the superior temporal gyrus, which is shown there on the right, has been strongly associated with the processing of speech sounds. And in a previous study, I found something very interesting about this process, which is that speech sounds properties, they're not just processed and discarded at the same rate with which new inputs come in, but actually so if you take a speech sound distinction like P and B, for example, this distinction is encoded in neural activity for a very long period of time. So about half a second after the point at which the signal is dissipated from the auditory input, you can still decode that difference from the neural responses. And in this previous work, I was focused on understanding the benefits that this has to the processing system. So you could imagine a scenario where a speech sound is ambiguous, say, between a P and a B. But if you're willing to wait a little period of time, information that comes later in time can actually be informative enough to disambiguate the identity of a speech sound that you heard earlier. So there's clear advantages to maintaining information for a long period of time. However, this also raises some interesting questions or potential problems. So if we take this very simple word like hello, well, when the first sound enters into the ear, it then is processed by superior temporal gyrus based on previous work, and it seems to be processed for a long period of time. That's what I just described to you. But then the duration of this sound actually is only about 80 milliseconds. So very quickly, the next sound enters the ear, is processed by the same brain area, and also is processed for a long period of time. And so each of these subsequent sounds come in, all of them are processed by the same brain area, and all of them seem to overlap in time. So by the time you're hearing the last sound of the word, you can read out all of the previous sounds from this same brain response. So this led me to ask a couple of questions. First of all, if the brain is processing multiple sounds at the same time in the same brain area, how does it not get confused about the identity of those speech sounds? And second of all, how does it correctly recall the order with which those sounds entered into the system? Because that's going to be crucial for correctly figuring out what words it is that are being said. So I wanted to test a specific hypothesis here, which the idea is that rather than the same set of neural populations being recruited for all of this same throughout the duration of processing, the hypothesis is that the information remains local within this brain area, but it moves or adjusts its configuration as a function of time. And so what this would mean is that as the next sound comes in, the way the previous sound is encoded has shifted its configuration. And so they're essentially not fighting over the same neural real estate to process these same sounds at the same time. Okay, so to address this question, I used the same data set that I just described to you. But rather than focusing the analysis on those 16,000 words, I'm instead going to focus the analysis on the phonemes in the stories instead. And I annotated those stories for the identity and timing of all of the phonemes, as well as where they occur in the word, because I want to be able to read out the properties of those sounds of the first phoneme of the word separately from the second, separately from the third, so we can understand how these sequences are processed. So to give you some specific details of how this analysis works, I train a series of decoders on the responses to all phonemes, regardless of that phoneme's position in the word. And I'm training different decoders at different latencies relative to when the sound begun, because I potentially want to capture that the way the information is encoded earlier in time is different from how the information is encoded later in time. I'm then going to evaluate the accuracy of these decoders, but separately now as a function of that phoneme's position in the word. So we'll get a readout of decodability of the features of the first phoneme separately from the second, separately from the third, etc. Okay, so again, just to make sure that everyone's on board of how this works, for any given time slice, I have this data matrix with, again, 208 channels. This time trial means all of the phonemes, and I'm learning this optimal set of coefficients which map the channels to the given property of speech here. And I repeat this for all of the time steps n. And the question is, can I use the model coefficients that I trained at one given time point, but apply the MEG data at a different time point and still accurately be able to recover the stimulus properties in doing that? Okay, so the results that I'm going to show you on the next slide under those two different hypotheses will look like either one of these two. So if it's the case that actually the same neural populations are processing these sounds throughout the duration of processing, in the next slide you should see a square shape type pattern where the coefficients that we look at this time point are relevant for processing all the way through to other time points. However, if information is reconfiguring itself as a function of time, on the next slide we should see something which looks more like a diagonal shape. Okay, so let's look at the decoding of the features of the first phoneme of the word. And here we're looking at in this two-dimensional decoding performance space. So there's a few things to read out from this visualization. The first is you can begin to be able to decode the features of this sound starting about 100 milliseconds, and that lasts until around 450 milliseconds. But what is crucial here is that any given topography that was learned, so any given decoder, is only informative for a much shorter duration than that, at about 80 milliseconds. So what this tells us, based on the hypothesis I proposed, is that the way that the information is encoded here has evolved by the time it's over here, evolved over here. So the information is reconfiguring itself across space as a function of time. And I find evidence for this dynamic coding scheme, not just for the first phoneme of the words, but also for the second, for the third, for the fourth, for the fifth, as well as the last phoneme of the words working backwards as well. So all phoneme positions seem to share this dynamic coding scheme. And we realized that this actually equips the brain with a number of processing advantages. So if I highlight a horizontal slice of this plot, you can see that there's virtually no overlap in the contour of one phoneme and its neighbors. And what that reflects is the fact that by the time the next sound has come in, the encoding of the previous sound has already sufficiently altered its encoding pattern. And I think that this is precisely what stops the brain from getting confused about the identity of these overlapping speech sounds. Similarly, if I take a vertical slice of this plot half a second after the word began, we confirm that we can read out the history of multiple speech sounds. So I can decode the last 3 sounds that entered into the ear. But what I think is most exciting about all of this is that not only can I read out the identity of these speech sounds, I can also read out the relative order with which they entered into the ear. So this trajectory is systematic. For a given feature, it always reconfigures itself in the same way over time. And so I know that more time has gone by since the first sound entered the ear as compared to the second, as compared to the third. And so I can read out not just what those sounds were, but their relative order. And I think that this is precisely how the brain solves this issue of ordering without requiring an explicit ordinal position encoding. And this actually reminded me of a similar type of computational solution. So in transformer models, there's also this type of relative positional and encoding through encoding information at different phases through these different frequencies. And even though the actual mechanism at play is quite different, the idea that you can achieve positional encoding through relative positioning is common across both of these domains. And this is a totally independent convergence, which to me is really exciting. Yeah.
At the start of this section, you suggested, at least I interpret what you said to suggest that there's a spatial distribution over time. But the data you showed says just a difference in encoding. So did I misread or misunderstood what you said at the start about a spatial change?
Yeah, so there's 2 answers. One, in order for the decoders to be different, it means that the spatial pattern needs to be different. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're moving, say, posterior, anterior, but it does mean that the spatial configuration of that information has changed.
Could be interdigitized.
Sorry?
It could be interdigitized in some way, though. It doesn't have to be blob.
Right. Yeah. The only claim here is that the information has changed in its configuration. But I'm happy to show this after if we have time. I've done some analyses on some ECOG data to try to get at that question. It seems that you can observe fluctuations in the information over space. Thanks.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
So this is really a very interesting and intriguing analysis, and I just in the transformer version, those positional encodings are sort of additively superimposed.
Yes, right.
Which would just mean that they were orthogonal things, right? Essentially. So that's not exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the other alternative that jumps to my mind is the sort of the Wayne Wickelgren's idea of context-sensitive encoding.
Yeah.
And is that what you mean here? But Wickelgren's idea was that, okay, so an A is different when it's between a K and a P than it is when it's between an F and a Z or something.
Right, right.
But that doesn't necessarily capture it either. So is there just a little bit more you could share about what you actually think that change is capturing and how the word level would be able to tap into it invariantly across those different positions?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the important things here is that I tested exactly the kind of context-sensitive encoding, so that AXB would be encoded different from CXD, and no, it generalizes perfectly well from one context to another. So the idea is that not that it's a context-sensitive encoding, but just that the information changes in such a systematic way as a function of time. All you need to know is what that feature was and what that trajectory is for that feature, in order to read out just how much time has elapsed since that sound begun. So you can read out from relative elapsed time, relative position, but it's not position per se that is being encoded. It's just how much time has gone by.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry, one more technical question. The decoders, are they linear decoders? They are.
Yeah.
So that implies that their relationship is an orthogonal transformation. Is that right? A rotation? Like
Sorry?
the relationship between two decoders that you train is going to be a rotation if they're linear. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's I mean, two decoders could be more or less similar to one another. They don't necessarily need to be orthogonal to each other. Do you mean different decoders as a function of time?
Yeah, so you train a decoder at one time and a decoder at another time.
Yeah.
And those are each linear readouts of the same input signal. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. So that places very strong constraints on the relationships between the encoders, right? Like in order to not be correlated with the same thing, they have to have rotated into a different direction.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, but there's many possible ways in which they could have rotated out of a meaningful projection of the information. Yeah.
I guess the question, kind of meta question, is like how strongly constrained are your results by the fact that you're using these very constrained families of decoders?
Yeah, I think it would be a great advancement of this work actually to try nonlinear decoding methods. I mean, at some point I stopped being able to decode that information, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It means that it's not linearly readoutable. And it maybe is possible, given how much data we have for these story listening. We're looking at a relatively robust signal because it's quite close to the acoustic processing. That, yeah, it'd be worth trying some nonlinear decoders too and comparing the results. Thanks.
Hi there. You were talking about how the encoding is relative to like time elapsed.
Right.
Is there a limit to how long that time is? And is that consistent with I think other studies of how long we can retain phonemes?
Yeah. So I found that the time elapsed is, say, the clock continues for about half a second, but again, that depends on, I need to be able to read out the information successfully with my linear decoder in order to be able to reconstruct that trajectory. So it's not, maybe the clock continues past half a second, but is encoded in a nonlinear way as per the previous question. But yeah, at least based on these results, about half a second seems to be the time frame. And this actually matches with some really beautiful studies that were conducted in the 60s, looking at similar questions of what's the latency with which you can provide subsequent information, and that influences perceptual reports that people give. And actually half a second aligns with those previous studies too. So it's, to me, I'm pretty confident that's the right ballpark. Thanks. Good. Okay, great. Yeah, so the final thing that I wanted to show you here is this dynamic coding scheme. It's not just a special thing that happens to the processing of phonetic features. So I applied the same analysis to the sublexical properties, the lexical properties, syntactic operation, and the semantic features too. And all of them show the same type of diagonal, which, as I explained, means that the information gets reconfigured as a function of time. Yeah, and as you can also see, the speed with which the information changes also seems to scale with the unit over which that feature is relevant. And to me, this is exciting because it actually puts this as a potential canonical computation that happens at multiple different types of features, and serves to get all of the processing advantages that I explained for the phonetic level. Okay, so what computation supports speech sequence processing? I showed you that there's rapid spatial evolution of phonetic encoding over time. Okay, so the final thing that I wanted to show you is evidence that I have about how speech feature representations actually get implemented at the level of individual neurons. So the studies that I presented so far have all used magnetoencephalography, which we're recording from very large populations of neurons. But in this final study, I'm going to go all the way to the other spatial, other side of the spatial continuum to look at individual neuronal responses across the cortical depth with neuropixel probes. Okay, so as I introduced in that previous study, it's been long established that the superior temporal gyrus, or STG, plays a fundamental role in speech processing, whereby neural populations along the STG have been shown to encode different acoustic phonetic features of sounds like plosives, fricatives, nasals, etc. And in this schematic, here I'm highlighting in orange the neural populations would respond to a plosive sound like P or B. However, a spatial axis that's been previously inaccessible to researchers is that of cortical depth. So underneath any one of those single XY coordinates on the surface of the brain, there are, of course, thousands of neurons organized under a laminar structure, which represents the neuronal architecture of the human cortex. So in this study, we wanted to understand how the tuning of the neurons in these putative cortical columns are organized and what those neurons are tuned to. So, for example, do neurons exhibit homogeneous tuning? So if I was to target an area where from the surface it would look like this neural population encodes plosive sounds, do all of the neurons in that cortical column all encode the same thing of plosive sounds? Or alternatively, perhaps the tuning is more heterogeneous. So in that case, perhaps there's a dominant feature, which would be that which is reflected at the cortical surface, but there are also neurons which encode other types of speech features as well. So concretely, our questions are, what speech features are encoded in individual neurons? And second, how is that tuning organized as a function of cortical depth? Before we get to that, though, let me first explain how it is that we were able to record single neurons from humans. So to do this, we used NeuroPixels probes. So along its 1 centimeter length, there are 384 electrode contacts that can be recorded from simultaneously. And that gives the ability to record from hundreds to thousands of neurons at the same time. And this technology has provided a huge leap forward for work in animal models. And in recent work, we were able to demonstrate that this can also be safely and successfully used in humans in the context of the operating room. So in this study, we collected data from 5 volunteers who were patients undergoing resection of brain tissue to treat epilepsy. So during their awake brain surgery, we insert this NeuroPixels probe into tissue which is about to be removed as part of their clinical treatment. And the probe is inserted for 10 minutes while they listen to spoken sentences, and then the probe is safely removed and discarded. So here is the MRI of patient number 1, and in red is the schematic of where we inserted the probe. So you see that we insert the probe so that it has still some contacts in air and some contacts in white matter, so that we're sure that we're spanning the full cortical depth. And because this is tissue which is resected anyway, we actually can perform histology on the tissue around the probe in order to get an estimate of the layer boundaries based on cell body density. Okay, so what do the data look like using this method? Well, let me show you the neural spiking of one single neuron. For this example sentence, it was nobody's fault, which we repeated to the patient 10 times. So here's the phonemic transcription, the waveform, and the spectrogram of that sentence. And I'm also going to highlight in red where all of the nasals occurred, and this will be relevant later. Okay, so here, the x-axis is time, and each of these red lines is one spike of this neuron, and each row is one of the 10 repetitions of this sentence. So we're going to listen to this sentence with the spikes overlaid on top.
Nobody's fault. It was nobody's fault. It was nobody's fault.
Okay, so you can see that this neuron fires approximately the same time for the same duration every single time this same sentence is played. So now let's look at the responses of the same neuron, but now for a different sentence. So here again is the phonemic transcription, and I've again highlighted where the nasals are. Sorry, I should have mentioned that the timing on that previous sentence was pretty well aligned to when the N was occurring in that sentence. So now we're going to see if this neuron fires to these different nasals in this different sentence.
Junior, what on earth's the matter with you? Junior, what on earth's the matter with you?
Okay, so it doesn't seem to kick in until the second repetition, but hopefully you get the point. So this neuron across these two different sentences seems to fire very consistently in response to these nasal sounds, even though in the two sentences, the two speakers had overall very different pitched voices. Okay, so the consistency of this firing suggests that the neuron is encoding something specific about the speech input. So in order to understand what those features are, I fit a temporal receptive temporal receptive field encoding model. And this model includes all of the phonemes that can be identified across English. And I'm fitting the model with lags from 300 milliseconds before the spike to 100 milliseconds after. So just to make it clear, I'm using an encoding model here, trying to predict the neural activity, whereas in everything that I've discussed so far, I was using a decoding model, trying to reconstruct the stimulus property, just so that you've got that clear in your mind. Okay, so let's look at the weights of the TRF model for the neuron that we were just listening to. We see that there's strong weight on both the M and N, and practically no weight anywhere else. And so this matches the intuition that you might have had from looking at the rasters, which is that this neuron seems to be encoding nasal sounds. And we found a number of neurons which seem to encode these type of acoustic phonetic features. So for example, this neuron seems to encode high vowels, this low vowels, fricatives, nasals, and approximant. So in answering the question of what speech features are encoded, part of the answer to that question is that we find evidence for tuning of acoustic phonetic features, such that neurons fire in response to the groups of phonemes that share a given phonetic feature. But we don't find any evidence for responses to a phoneme category per se. Why is that important? It's important based on linguistic theory, and it's also important based on what the body of results have shown us using non-invasive research, which have suggested that the representation that the brain uses to process speech is these acoustic phonetic features. And here we're showing that remains true all the way down to the single neuron level, and it's not an artifact of aggregating responses over thousands of neurons together. Okay, but next I wanted to test not just acoustic phonetic features, but a full suite of features which have been proposed to be encoded in superior temporal gyrus in the past. So this includes, again, not just acoustic phonetics, but also modulations of the intensity, so how loud or not loud the speech is, the relative pitch of the speaker, lexical stress, and then statistical properties. So how likely is this given sound to occur? How likely is this given word to occur, given the previous sounds, given the previous words in the sentence? Okay, so I'm going to show you the results just for a single penetration of the probe. So this is just from one single cortical column. And I'm going to show you the unique R, so the unique variants which can be attributed to any one of these feature families. So let's first look at the acoustic phonetic features, which just kind of confirms what I showed you in the previous analysis, where we find that there are neurons which significantly encode these properties above and beyond the other properties that we include in the model. The critical question is this all we see? Is there just acoustic phonetics, or can there be other types of features in the same column? And we find that actually there are other types of features encoded as well. So here we predominantly have pitch encoding, which actually, and I'll get into this in a second, seems to be encoded more dominantly in a different set of neurons than to the acoustic phonetics. And there is statistically significant, although numerically much weaker, contribution of other features as well. So this is showing you the results just from a single penetration of the probe. Now let's aggregate over a number of subjects to address the question of how this information actually is organized by cortical layer. So here this is aggregating over three of the patients. And the most dominant thing that I wanted to highlight to you is that the neurons which encode pitch most strongly seem to be encoded more superficial than the neurons which encode acoustic phonetic features. The depth of these neurons is around about layer 3, whereas the depth of these neurons is around about layer 4, 5. Yeah.
So where are these recordings relative to A1?
Much more anterior.
So hierarchically, how distant from A1?
Yeah, I guess it depends how you believe projections work. Hypothetically, there could be projections directly from the thalamus into this area of STG, or it could be fed from A1 to STG. There's a bit of a debate right now as to whether there are direct connections to this brain area or not. So it's a bit uncertain. Thanks. Yeah, Brian.
Go ahead.
Easy question. So in the anatomy, what's these steps represent the different layer of the cell body?
Yeah. So it's not ideal for me to project different patients' data onto the same depth axis, because actually the cortical depth will vary person to person, region to region. And where precisely the layers are also is going to be different. But approximately, this would be, so layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, layer 5, layer 6.
Thanks. Normally I think of pitch as a perceptual attribute, and frequency is the stimulus referred
yeah.
one. Are you meaning pitch here in the sense
yeah,
that it's not a frequency?
I
effect?
very much mean pitch. So this is relative pitch of the speaker after you normalize. So this is that person talking in their own towards the higher or lower end of their own pitch range, normalized for the overall actual frequency input. So
and could you say just a little more? And the size of these circles it says unique R.
Right.
So 0.08 means.
Yeah, this is how, given all of the variance that our model can explain, how much variance is this feature accounting for? So this is, yeah, nearly 1%.
So each circle corresponds to what?
Sorry, each circle is 1 neuron.
And you're plotting only the neurons that do significantly well.
Yeah, so each time we do this, we get around about 100 neurons. And out of those 100 neurons, about 80% of them seem to respond to speech more than a silent baseline. And for those neurons that respond higher to speech than silence, we can account for their activity pretty well with these encoding models. So I'm just plotting the neurons for which our models account for significant variance. Thank you.
Hi, when you look at the encoding weights in the last slide, the heat map, do you see any temporal separations of different features? Like, for example, is pitch processed first, then acoustic phonemes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The short answer is no, but mainly because the model weights that we have are not so stable. So we're obviously very restricted in terms of how long we could record for. And 10 minutes of recording is really not very long to be able to fit these model weights and be able to make claims about relative latencies. Yeah, it seems that there isn't a clear latency difference, although maybe you would expect there to be. For example, if pitch was being derived from the vowels that are processed, then you would expect a systematic latency difference. What I can say to that point, though, is I did fit spectrotemporal receptive fields. And these seem to be a little bit, and for some of the neurons which were explained very well by these, you do see latency shifts as a function of depth. I'm happy to show those after if there's interest. Yeah, at the back.
Previously, you showed us how information could be decoded at later stages in time. Have you run an analysis with these data to look at that temporal residual at the single neuron level?
Yeah, good question. Within this spatial extent, the information doesn't seem to propagate so much over time. So that also lends to the idea that I have that the reason that we see this information being sustained over time is because it is actually being routed across space.
So I'm really curious about the link between these temporal receptive fields and your, which is an encoding model to your decoding model, because your decoding was instantaneous, really.
Right.
But so I was really interested to know if you see some hierarchical structure to the temporal receptive field. So as you ascend the hierarchy, perhaps the temporal receptive field change over time, and maybe they have bigger temporal window, which might explain your decoding results.
Yeah, so it is the case that the weights of, say, something like pitch are more smeared over time. But again, this gets to, I think it was Jason's question earlier, that the feature itself is more prolonged over time. So pitch will stay at a certain pitch range before it then changes. So it's hard for me to say with this little data and with such a kind of correlated set of features, if that is truly a result or if it's just a fact of the correlation in the stimulus. Okay, so maybe I'll conclude, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as we have. So I alluded to this point, which is the relative depth with which I see evidence for the encoding of these different properties does actually make a lot of sense given the kind of canonical circuit diagram that's been created based on primate A1. So if we believe that the inputs from the thalamus are being received to layer 4, that's the same layer that we should see the encoding of more instantaneous properties like acoustic phonetics, because you don't need many time samples in order to derive that property from the input. And contrast that with layer 3, which has much more recurrent computation, which is precisely what you would need in order to generate a property like pitch, which again, by definition, needs to have be created over more time samples in order to derive it. Okay, so to summarize this then, unlike what has been observed in A1, where there is more homogeneous tuning, here we see that there's very heterogeneous tuning across the cortical depth. But I showed you that that heterogeneity doesn't mean that the encoding is randomly scattered, but actually the features seem to specifically localize to given depths. And I said the reasons why that would make sense. And finally, I think it's really exciting, the idea that features which exist at these very different timescales coexist within the same cortical column. And I think this has, again, the system is very clever. What does this give you? Well, it gives you local access to information such that you can perform computations very quickly without having to kind of extract information from another area. And of course, all of this has the much larger implication that this is essentially the first demonstration that we can use neuropixels probes in humans safely and successfully to understand speech comprehension. And I think that this really represents a major paradigm shift in the type of questions that we're going to be able to ask and the precision with which we're going to be able to answer them. Okay, so how are speech features implemented at the level of single cells? I think that the main point here is that there is parallel encoding of these multiple speech properties. Okay, so just to summarize then what it is that I have told you about this speech processing system. First, we learned that the brain generates a very rich set of representations from the input, and it appears to do so in a top-down, then parallel, and then bottom-up manner. And we saw that these representations are embedded within this evolving spatial code. And we did a deep dive into this at the phonetic level, and I also teased you by showing that this also seems to be true at all hierarchical levels, potentially. And finally, one of the message which I really think is common across all of what I've shown you today is just how much parallel processing there is going on here. So I've shown you that the full linguistic hierarchy can be encoded at the same time. There's also encoding of history of multiple speech sounds at the same time. And then just now I showed you that these different properties can all be encoded in parallel in the same cortical column. And so I think that this is a very important aspect of the speech processing system that really can't be underestimated. Okay, so just very briefly, but before I end, I just wanted to leave you with some of my top priorities for future steps. So first of all of the studies I presented here today use a naturalistic approach to studying language comprehension. And that, of course, has a lot of advantages that I described, but it also comes with the big caveat that we don't have an online measure of how much someone is understanding moment by moment. And in order to better understand why the brain generates the representations it does and how it does that, I want to understand which of those representations are only encoded in neural activity in the situation where somebody's actually understanding what they're hearing. And in focusing more on operations, I think it's critical to understand the dynamics over which these different processes occur. So throughout this talk, I threw a lot of time scales at you. I was like, a phoneme is X milliseconds long, or this process takes Y milliseconds. And are these timescales hard-coded into the system, Or do they scale with the speed of the input? And if they scale, what are the limits over that? And I really think that this will help us to understand what those computations are. Secondly, I'd really like to reconcile the results I showed you in those last two studies. So bringing together population level activity with the spiking of single neurons. And in particular, I'd like to use the empirical spiking parameters that we can get from neuropixels to implement a spiking neural network system, which we can use to emulate and simulate the auditory cortex. And I think this is a powerful way to test different hypotheses of how what we observe at the population level may actually be implemented all the way down to the single cell. And finally, we of course live in an extremely exciting time to do science, given how much technological advances are happening, particularly in the realm of language models. And until very recently, the human brain was actually the only system to have achieved speech comprehension. But now there exist speech recognition systems that in some cases can even vastly outperform humans. And this is really exciting to me because I think that these present themselves as very useful animal models for which we can extensively probe their computational solutions and generate hypotheses for the operations and representations that they're using in order to solve this problem. And I think this is really going to fast forward our progress in understanding the very nitty-gritty details of how speech comprehension is achieved. Okay, so to end, I really believe that bringing together insight from neuroscience, data science, and cognitive science is going to lead to breakthroughs and understanding the computational architecture that supports speech comprehension. And I'm extremely proud to work at the forefront of this multidisciplinary initiative. Thank you so much.
Considering we're at time, I encourage you to. Oh, right.